Welcome to The Landscape, a podcast to shed light on the people, programs, and businesses that are changing the landscape for individuals with any type of disability. Deb Dagit is a leading name in both diversity and inclusion and disability rights. Deb lobbied for the Americans with Disabilities Act and was present at its signing. She was also a pioneer in the diversity and inclusion movement. She currently runs Deb Dagit Diversity LLC, where she provides consulting, project support, and public speaking. Today's conversation starts with Deb explaining how she arrived at her unique view of privilege.
Sure. When I first started hearing the terms power and privilege in the corporate setting, and noticing how many women and people of color and other groups really felt almost allergic to the idea of power and privilege. It was kind of synonymous with the dominant group. And when I reflected upon what power and privilege is, it's actually situational. And the first time I remember experiencing power and privilege, I was actually in Stanford Children's Hospital. I have a brittle bones condition called osteogenesis imperfecta, and you fracture the most when you're a child. And back in the 60s, when I was getting care for broken bones, they either would put my legs in traction, wrapping them up and tying weights to the end of the bed, which held them in place for 5 to 6 weeks, or in a big cast called a spica cast that went from your chest to your toenails with a bar in between your legs to immobilize everything. But, once you were in the cast or the traction, the pain quickly subsides and you're just bored. There's not a lot to do. And back then, you were not allowed very many visitors. In fact, because my mom worked and I have a younger brother, I only saw her on Sundays. And that was just for a couple hours. So I was trying to think of things to do, and there were other kids cycling through the hospital, the girls' ward, all the time. And most of them had never been in a hospital before. And some had English as a second language, and, they and their parents were pretty scared and upset. So the nurses started putting the new arrivals in the bed next to me, and I would explain how things work around here. I would show them how to make a juice at a time, how to get good food, explain, the procedures and make them less scary. And after a while, it was like I was a trustee in a prison because I was basically incarcerated. But the doctors and nurses and technicians thought of me as a valuable asset and ally. And so I would get special food, outside the hospital food from McDonald's and pizza. I would get stuffed animals. And believe it or not, after a while, I actually viewed that as a more positive experience than being at home, because I was kind of like an adult as a kid, and it was kind of fun and rewarding. So I came to see power and privilege as situational, in that my knowledge of the hospital system gave me unique insights and certainly privilege in ways that a child would want. And throughout the rest of my life, I looked at privilege through that lens, whether I had it or I needed it.
Right.
And learned the value of being vulnerable and allowing others to give you some of their power and privilege to get through difficult situations.
Right. I love that story because I often... it's upsetting that people look at privilege almost as a bad word. At least some people do. And I always thought to myself, everybody has privilege, but I love how you put it. It is situational, right? It's like, it's where you are and who you're talking to and maybe what country you're in or what neighborhood you're in. And so I love that you put a phrase to it for me. Now, tell us a little bit about how you went from being that little girl who was in the hospital quite a bit to going through the school system and saying in your head, I'm going to be an advocate, or I'm going to change the world, basically.
I wasn't sure what I was going to do when I grew up. Like a lot of people who spend a lot of time in the healthcare system, I thought I was going to be a doctor. That's who my role models were. But being 4 feet tall and um, having brittle bones, at the time, now it can be done, and there are little people who are doctors and nurses, but at the time, that was deemed insurmountable. So I ended up getting my um, bachelor's and master's in clinical psychology. And as I was going through school, I was applying what I was learning in the different jobs that I had, and those were entry level HR type roles. And I got involved in helping people with disabilities get placed into jobs. What had happened is I was in a company where they wouldn't even allow me to interview for a promotional opportunity. They said I was lucky to even have a job. So I formed my own nonprofit organization and did job placement. And during that time, the Americans with Disabilities Act was on Capitol Hill. And my congressman was one of the sponsors, Norm Mineta. And he asked me to help lobby for it and address the concerns of the business community and his colleagues. And I was invited to be at the ADA when it was signed. And I realized I was at a crossroads in my life. Should I stay in the nonprofit sector, go to government, or work in a corporation? And I decided corporations were the biggest soapbox. You were more likely to affect change.
Right.
People copy what companies do, especially the big brands. And I was doing some contract work for a company called Sun Microsystems in California. And it was supposed to just be a 3-month assignment. But I looked around for other things to do because complying with the ADA didn't even take 10% of my time. And there was this new thing that everybody was experimenting with called diversity and inclusion. And I thought,
what year was this again?
It was 1991.
Okay.
And so they had their fledgling employee resource groups for people of color and women and veterans and people with disabilities. And at that time, the way you did affirmative action in EEO, they had this thing called good faith. And you would place expensive ads in glossy magazines. And then if you got audited, you'd show the ads. And it didn't matter if you got a single resume, right?
Right.
And companies routinely would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on this. So I got the employee resource groups together and the poor ad company that was, white-faced and grim. And I said, what do you think of these ads? And people said they were silly, boring, unbelievable. And then I said, have you ever seen any of these publications? And they said, nope, never seen them. So I knew what was going to happen. Remember, I'm still just a contractor, only supposed to be doing the ADA. Uh-huh. And I had a friend of mine take pictures. And we put the pictures into the much less expensive publications that our ERGs recommended in an ad that had the pictures laid out scrapbook style. And it said, we're not where we want or need to be on our diversity journey, but we're excited about it. Would you like to join us?
Nice.
The ad got all kinds of awards. We got a ton of resumes. And we used the extra money for scholarships for high school students who wrote essays about why the company they work for someday needs to respect their culture, their identity. And that's how I got my first job. I was 32. So was our CEO. And he liked the chutzpah to do that. These days you would not be able to do that as a contractor. But then I was embraced by other people who were forming the field, who wanted to include disability in the agenda for diversity and inclusion. And it just went on from there. So it was, I lucked into it in many ways, but it also was because my life had pretty much prepared me for that kind of a role.
So let's talk about that for a second. How did your life prepare you for that? I mean, what kind of supports did you have? I mean, because so frequently, as you know, people are discouraged from like one of your employers said, like you're lucky to even have a job. So when you hear things like that, like how did you have the confidence and fortitude to say, no, I'm going to go out and become part of this corporate world and work with government and all of these things? How did you get from A to B?
Well, it's a great question and an important one. There were always people from other underrepresented groups. I have to say, in reflecting upon it, almost all of them were either of African heritage or from the LGBTQ community. And they were my mentors. Some cases they were my boss. Sometimes they were someone I met at a conference, and they took me under their wing and spoke up for me, sponsored me, were really helpful in accelerating my learning, and encouraged me. I think one of the most powerful mentoring conversations I ever had is with a very famous trailblazer in diversity named Dr. Price Cobbs. He wrote some really important seminal books. He was a psychiatrist, and he and I met when I was working at a company where my boss, who was an African American man, said he was only going to hire other African American men at the top of his part of the business. And when I told him he couldn't do that because everybody was threatening to sue, he had to hire women, he had to hire whoever was the most qualified. And he said, white men have been doing this forever, it's my turn. So Dr. Hobbs was supposed to be the one to set me straight. He was supposed to tell me, oh, well, of course he can do that. But instead, after hearing about the situation, he turned to this gentleman that I worked for and said, I don't know what you're paying this woman, but whatever it is, it's not enough, and you ought to listen to her. Well, then he took me to dinner, and he taught me something that was really, really important. I was never going to have a boss with a disability. That just wasn't in the cards at that time. So I couldn't learn from somebody who was ahead of me career-wise, who had gone on my life path. But Price said, how were you raised to think about your identity as a woman with a disability? And I said, well, I was told if I didn't let it bother me and I didn't make it an issue for anyone else, then I might be allowed to participate, and that I should just pretend like I didn't have a disability. And that way I would get to be inspirational instead of to be pitied. And he said, if you want to be a diversity professional, that's not going to work. In order for you to identify with people from groups that are not part of your identity, you need to tell your story. You need to share the challenges that you face. Because even though they're your challenges and not the same, it will show people that you get it, that you understand. And it took me a few years to internalize and operationalize that. I mean, after spending, about a third of my life, being very careful not to make my disability an issue, as I was told. This was a whole new way of thinking about it, and that was a game changer for me.
If we can talk a little bit about grit, because like you said, you had to overcome a lot of things, and being diversity and inclusion, when, like you said, when people look at you, they want to feel like you can relate to some of the struggles that I have and some of the obstacles I have to overcome. What were some of the bigger obstacles that you had to overcome? Or even more specifically, was there a time where you just felt like, yeah, I can't do this anymore, or I'm just ready to go home and get into bed for the rest of the century?
Yeah, there were a lot of times. There were a lot of times where I couldn't get a job, or I got a very entry-level job for which I was way overqualified. I had people overtly tell me, I had a situation where a company flew me from California to New York City, first class, put me up in a 5-star hotel, sent a limousine to pick me up. And this is after they'd interviewed me many, many times over the phone. And as soon as the recruiter saw me, he canceled 3 days of interviews and sent me home.
Wow.
And things like that are pretty crushing. It also happened to be on my 40th birthday. Wild way to spend your birthday. Um, at the time we were facing Y2K, so what's not to be, it was kind of like these days with the coronavirus. Um, so I would say what got me through it is a community of other people with disabilities who were going through similar situations. So I didn't feel isolated. My husband and the 3 children that we adopted are all individuals with disabilities. So I could shelter in place in a different way away from the world.
Hmm.
But I guess I always had a few people, again, almost always of African or LGBTQ heritage, who cheered me on and told me I could do it, and gave me a lot of tough love. I guess also I just have to say, I mean, if you get up every day and go on about your life knowing that the slightest trip or someone bumping into you or slipping on a slippery surface could result in a major fracture, really boards of directors and people in the C-suite aren't all that scary.
Hmm.
I've had to go to the hospital many, many times all by myself, even as a child, and get the doctors and nurses to take care of me in the right way. When sometimes they had to make, the splint or the equipment or whatever. And so I guess I found myself alone. I was also a latchkey kid. So that meant, for those of us of a certain age, I had a working class single mom. When my brother and I got home from school, I started babysitting him when I was 9 and he was 6.5. And before that, we would be left alone for shorter periods of time, but starting at about that age, making dinner and, things of that nature. So there was a lot of independence. I guess the final thing I would say is maybe it was better. I didn't have in my vocabulary the word ableist
Hmm.
because I did encounter people who were ableist, meaning kind of like racism or sexism, that they were phobic or uncomfortable around me just because I had a disability right from the get go. But I had an interesting mental model that I wrote about back in the early 90s about how people see me. And it was as ET, an extraterrestrial, in which case they wanted to know if I did everything, a gnome or troll, like something under a bridge, or a leprechaun, which I was lucky somehow. And so what I started doing is once I knew which it was that they had decided I was, I would try to move them into the leprechaun category. I think if I worked at it and a few good things happened to them as a result of being around me, they either got less scared of the gnome or they stopped being quite so curious because I answered most of the ET questions.
Right.
And I know that sounds weird, but that mental model worked better for me than if I had labeled them as ableist and avoided them.
Right. So you talked about how you were flown out and sent home packing on your birthday, which is terrible. I can't even imagine that. But I do know that you did end up working for a rather large Fortune 500 company. Can you tell us a little bit? Because I know that was a pretty incredible situation as well.
It was, and one where I really, as they say, got to sharpen my saw. I mean, doing diversity and inclusion in California does have its challenges, but back in the early 2000s, I joined a pharmaceutical company in New Jersey in 2001. And at the time, the whole pharmaceutical industry was just starting to think about doing diversity and inclusion. So I went from the left coast, where it was ubiquitous, to having to understand that I was in a place where white people whose ancestors were Italian or Polish or Irish considered themselves marginalized and repressed groups.
Hmm.
I couldn't conceptualize of that. in California, if you asked a white person what their identity was, they'd shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know, I'm 57, which isn't particularly helpful either. But, that's maybe part of white fragility. But I had a hard time for the first few years. I felt like everything I did was wrong. And everything I did was too bold, too much, too over the top, too open. And people were literally terrified of diversity, which I was flummoxed by. When I set up the voicemail for my phone, back then it was a very voicemail intensive culture, the date I put in was the date that I thought I could last to before I had to leave because I couldn't take it anymore. What would look okay to me? And it was 2 years from my start date. Like I could make it for 2 years, and my husband would tell you I spent a lot of time sitting in my dark closet crying, saying I can't do this. But that old saw also. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I could go back to many times in my life I didn't think I was going to make it, and somehow I did and came out stronger on the other end. So I had to just keep telling myself that this will make me a better practitioner.
And so, how has the disability and inclusion landscape changed from the 90s until today? I mean, because you were on the forefront of it, and you're still working in it now. So what kind of progress have we made, and what else needs to be done?
Great question. So all the time I was a chief diversity officer, I had many other functions I was responsible for. At one time or another, I managed every corporate HR function except for compensation and benefits. And throughout my career, we integrated disability into everything we did at the three major firms that I worked for. And it wasn't that hard, but I noticed we would get scads of awards and be recognized, and there wasn't any competition in that space. So in 2013, I decided to leave my internal role and do consulting that is not only focused on disability. I still do general diversity and inclusion, but it's probably about 2/3 of what I do now. And what I realized is that we were taking the wrong approach to selling it in. We weren't doing a good job of explaining the size and the scope of the market. We weren't explaining that it's a civil rights, social justice issue. It's not philanthropic or charitable. That there's all kinds of amazing business cases for it, not just the size of the market, but managers who are good at managing people with disabilities are just better managers, period. And most of the tools that we now take for granted that are allowing us to work effectively for office-based jobs during the pandemic are tools that were created primarily because people with disabilities needed to work remotely in many cases, at least part of the time. I know I did after a fracture or surgery. And so I have put together quite a few different tools and resources and papers, and now work with almost 50 companies in order to help them become disability inclusive. And the longer they're at the work, the more bottom line business benefit that they feel that they're getting. I work with a nonprofit as a consultant called Disability In, and I love their model because it's businesses teaching each other how to be disability inclusive. And what I really love is the last couple of years, they now are working across intersections. So mental health disabilities are amongst the most prevalent inside corporations and also on our college campuses where many companies are recruiting. And they are seeing that by working with all of their employee resource groups and understanding how disability impacts and shows up differently for people of color, for people of different faiths, veterans, the LGBTQ community, they are seeing huge benefits. one thing I would challenge any company to do that thinks, no, that's not true in my organization, is all I want you to do is go to your benefits department and ask in aggregate, not violating any HIPAA rules, what are the top 5 prescriptions your employees are taking?
Mm-hmm.
Amongst the top 5, I guarantee you, is something for depression and something for anxiety. And yet people are not self-identifying and asking for what they need. So the business case to make it easier for people. And now with the pandemic, as you might well imagine, if you already have some kind of a health condition, you're not only at a higher health risk if you contract the virus, but the concerns that you have about dealing with it. Imagine if you already had anxiety and depression,
Right.
and now you're sheltering in place and afraid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was speaking to a friend who's a counselor, and we were talking about how it's the worst case scenario for a person that has depression is being forced to isolate. Like isolation, just always, short periods of being alone is very healthy. But when you're talking weeks and maybe months now of being cut off from people, I mean, that can really, make that depression just so much worse. Um, so you work with all of these companies. How many of them, just like you talked about the magazine, how people would buy articles, how many of them hired you? And I don't want you to name names, with the ideal of this is just something we need to do. And what percentage would you say just really had an honest desire to improve themselves?
Well, I would say because the way the model's set up and my relationship with Disability In and the price point to become a member to get the services, not just from me, but from my subject matter expert colleagues, is such that it's highly unlikely that people would join the group that we call Inclusion Works if they weren't really serious.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of people who hire me privately outside of that, I mean, I know this sounds egotistical, but I have a pretty well-known brand in diversity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And so they know they're hiring someone who's an expert in the field, and they wouldn't hire me unless they were really taking it seriously, because the role I play is to integrate it into every part of the people practices and business. And that means having access to their CEO and that individual's direct reports. They're not going to want someone that, they're not really comfortable with, who they've brought into the organization, unless they have a degree of confidence that you can hold your own and be professional and have gravitas and all of that. I think it's really interesting that, when I was a kid and I wasn't quite 21, 19, 20, and I wanted to get into casinos and bars like all kids that age, I was trying to get fake ID. And my mom told me not to bother because I could shoplift a canoe and no one would ask me what I was doing. And one of the things that's interesting in answer to your question is that while people will hire me for my expertise, I think it's really interesting that when I go meet with powerful executives, in part, they let me into their office and they let me try things because they think it's not really going to work, like that they're humoring me. And they want to be nice to the little woman with the disability. And, it doesn't sound too bad. We could try that training, or we could bring in that speaker. This was all my internal jobs and all my consulting jobs. And then, before they know it, it's infiltrated, and now people like it, and they have new words in their lexicon, and they don't have enough seats for the training, and everyone wants to join the employee resource groups. And by then it's too late. I already lifted the canoe and I'm using it. So
Right.
I've used how I look as a tool, and instead of seeing it as, there being a downside that people doubt what I can accomplish, I see it as one of the divine interventions when I got picked to do this work.
Yeah. I think it's very much human nature that we follow the leader. And when so I think in my head, one of the places that we need to do work is with big corporations, because if you have, companies that are invested in diversity, like your Googles and your Disney Worlds and places like that, other companies see that and they want to follow suit. But also within the companies, like you mentioned, how important is it to have buy-in from the CEO, her or himself, instead of just like the VP or director of diversity and inclusion?
It's vitally important that the CEO, in the best case, is the strongest champion for diversity and inclusion. And in the case of getting anything done at all, is at least going to give lip service to it. If the CEO and just if not more importantly, the chief HR officer are not on board, then you're really wasting your time. They're going to be able to effectively be barriers. What's kind of an interesting trend is CEOs who have recently either grown up through the ranks to be named the top person or have recently joined, who have religion, if you will, about diversity, and the top walker is their head of HR. And therefore, the diversity and inclusion person calling me and saying, I don't understand, I can't get my HR colleagues to work with me. I coined the term friendly fire because you're usually embedded in the HR function, and yet that's where the most barriers are to getting things done. And unfortunately, the reason for that is that many of the HR folks think that they'll be seen in a more positive light if they block something that many executives aren't comfortable with. And two, they haven't received the training in diversity and inclusion, so they are as uncomfortable as anyone else for whom this is new. And it's just something that they worry is taking away from trying to convince people that human resources is vitally important to the P&L, to the bottom line. And also diversity and inclusion jobs tend to be ones that are kind of an interesting hybrid, in that you end up spending not only a lot of time working internally, but externally with communications and social media and public relations and government relations. So there's a lot of glory, and people get jealous because they see you showing up as the company's spokesperson and in various publications. So it's something that we need to talk more about in order to tackle, but it's hard because you can't complain about it publicly without it making your situation worse.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is D&I professionals get together with each other and give each other coaching and support and mentoring in safe places to get ideas about how to overcome friendly fire.
I just recently went to a diversity and inclusion conference, and so I heard many. The positions are different everywhere. Some of them have VPs, and some of them have directors. Some of them are in HR. Some of them are separate from HR. But it was fascinating to me the different experiences that they were having in making any kind of headway. And one of the issues was size. So if you took, a company that's, let's say, 4,000 employees to 10,000 employees, how long does it really take to change the culture of the entire company? Like to where you're hiring like management level positions, this diverse, and all the way down to the entry level.
Well, it depends on where you're starting out. If there's a lot of resistance, it's not a very diverse organization. they're a business to business versus a business to consumer. So the business case is harder for people to see. I would say generally that period of time is going to be in the neighborhood of actually 10 years. Because they're going to have to change so much from the bottom up. I would say for companies who have some of the factors that they need, that have a stronger business case, that are starting out with at least a few senior executives who are committed and are willing to get visibly involved, you can shorten it to as little as 5 years. But, it really does take time, because to change the culture towards anything, like, companies who are adopting things like Six Sigma or other ways of making their companies more efficient, it takes that long for that, and there's almost no resistance, right?
Right.
So to take each element and integrate it. A huge mistake that companies made for a long time was that diversity was seen as something separate. And it wasn't until we fully integrated it, so that, for instance, you didn't have a diversity recruiter. All recruiters had to get a diverse pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
Or you didn't have diversity training. You had management training that diversity was an integral part of.
I've only heard you speak a couple times, but I've always been somewhat in awe of you. And so I love listening to you speak. I feel like you're one of the smartest people I've ever heard. So I want to thank you for your time. But I always like to end with just some personal questions, like, what is a favorite book that you enjoy, or what is a favorite movie? And do you have any pets?
So I used to read a lot of books that were related to my job, but I will admit to a guilty pleasure. I can't stand reality TV, but book-wise, I did make my way through most things that were written by Nora Roberts, known as a romantic novelist with a little bit of mystery and mysticism thrown in. So yeah, that's my guilty pleasure. I like feel good movies. I make myself watch the things that I know are important, that are telling a story that needs to be told, that I need to be aware of. But I prefer feel good movies. My poor kids will lament that my husband and I raised them on the Waltons. We bought the DVD.
Yes.
My favorite current series that I have watched all of are Anne with an E and Call the Midwife, which, right, by the way, are not only feel good, but have a lot of diversity integrated into them. So I get a little bit of both. And I love dogs. I've always had a dog since I was 5. I currently have a Morkie, Maltese and Yorkie. She weighs about 6 pounds. And we actually got her at 10 weeks old and trained her as a service dog. So she's an emotional support dog. And one of the things that happened as a result of all my treatments is I have post-traumatic stress. So she's very comforting when I'm feeling anxious about getting hurt, or I'm in the hospital, or having nightmares at night. And it's not too hard to train a little dog of what to do. They basically just comfort you. And if I'm having a nightmare, she wakes me up. But that's really been a special blessing in my life.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. And like I said, I'm a big fan, and I will be following your work as I've done. I was just on a webinar that you did, which I really, really enjoyed. We're actually looking at starting an ERG around diversity in my company, and I'm a part of developing that. So that was very helpful for me. For more information on today's guest, visit her website at debdagitdiversity.com. That's Deb Dagit Diversity, all one word, .com. And for more information on Disability In, visit disabilityin.org. On the next episode, we will have a conversation with Dr. Cheryl Fleisch of Vanderbilt Medical Center and Ashley Blum the director of the Homeless Outreach Program at Park Center, a mental health nonprofit organization in Nashville, Tennessee. We will discuss their collaboration on the Street Psychiatry Program, which provides assessments and treatment to homeless individuals in the Nashville area. This was the first program of its type in the country. Hope to see you then.